Hey folks, this is Stephen Pitts, host of Black Work Talk, an Organizing Upgrade podcast. Here we look at efforts around the country to build the collective power of Black workers.
You better listen, my brother, because if you do, you can hear.
Dear friends, welcome to the Labor Radio Podcast Network series highlighting the work of our members. The growing network of over 80 shows in 5 countries serves as a one-stop shop for audiences looking for labor content and as a resource for labor broadcasters, podcasters, and content producers. My name is Evan Papp, and I produce Empathy Media Lab's podcast on labor, political economy, art, and culture, and we're a proud member of the Labor Radio Podcast Network. Today, I'm speaking with Stephen Pitts, who is host of Black Work Talk, which is a show about building collective power of Black workers. Stephen, thanks for coming on. Could you talk a little bit about yourself, where you grew up, and what got you interested in organized labor?
First, I'm glad to be on the show. Today's kind of good day. I'm in Oakland, California. Been raining lots of sun's out today, so I'm glad to kind of spend part of my day with you, then other part outside, walking around, enjoying the air in a protected way, by the way. But so I'm from Chicago, born and raised, and grew up in what I call the 60s good old days. And so that was part of my kind of the air I breathe in many ways, idea of radicalism and politics. And went to Harvard as undergraduate. I got out of high school in 70, and I graduated from Harvard in 74. I was involved in a lot of the different movements there for around Black studies, Black students, Black community stuff, Black liberation, anti-war stuff. And so for a lot of us in college, as we got radicalized, we saw the importance of actually organizing workers to transform society fundamentally. That's important to have other groups in motion, but we thought central to the idea of transforming society was the idea of organized workers themselves and organized Black workers. And we thought that Black workers in particular should be central to the idea of Black liberation. And so for some of us, the way we operate on that idea is we actually, after college, for me at least, we got jobs in factories. And so for me, it was a matter of going to Houston, Texas. And I got a job in an oil tool factory. That was in 1974. And I was in that factory for about 8 years. It was organized by steel workers, and we did some good stuff. I did some stupid stuff. At this point, I'm 21, 23, 24. You do good stuff and dumb stuff as part of the territory. And I kind of followed the map in that regards.
So Harvard into labor, what was Harvard like at that time, and just everything that was going on with the war, with a lot of like the Black Panthers and assassinations going on, and obviously Fred Hampton in Chicago. Harvard, yeah. What was kind of the scene there? I'm always kind of curious about, it's such this elite institution.
I have a long time on the show. So I want to keep it relatively brief. So, I got there, I call it tail end of the good old days. It's funny, I got there in the fall of 70. When we roll around to the spring semester of 71, there hadn't been spring final exams in 2 years because you had the big student strike in the spring of 69 around the various kind of anti-war things. You had the strike in 70 around Cambodian invasion. And so kind of part of the idea was, well, it's spring. Do we have classes now? We don't normally have classes, right? So that's kind of in the air in some level, not clear to everybody in some level. I think that a lot of the people who were kind of student activists at Harvard had actually left, either to do work down south, doing work in other parts of Boston. And so there's a small group of people still doing radical stuff. I kind of fell in with the Black Student Union activists and doing different campaigns. And I found a set of friends who are my best friends to this day, who saw it's important to not just be there of Harvard, but to be there to help try to learn things and change the world. And so we're involved in both campus politics. In particular, we're involved on the question of Harvard divestment in Gulf oil, because the Gulf oil is involved in Angola. And Angola at that time was a colony of Portugal. We also got involved off campus in supporting the Black Panthers in the survival programs. We helped staff some of the free breakfast programs they did and their liberation school, those sort of things. And got involved in some African liberation support activity as well. And so Harvard for me was a good time. both in terms of a lot of growth, in terms of a lot of learning, in terms of developing good friendships as well. If I had to redo, I'd do it different, but you can't be wise when you're 21 by definition, okay?
And then this work you were doing, you said Texas, or and what was that? And you said there was some union activity. Which union was it? And
well, the plant that we were in was the Hughes Tool Company, and Hughes is Howard Hughes, by the way. I talk about. They had a movie, I guess maybe 10 years ago, called The Aviator with Leonardo DiCaprio. At one point, he said, "Get money from my factory for my Hollywood films." And wait a second, that's my factory. My factory. I got excited in the theater, right? But Hughes Tool Company, oil tool company, made tools to drill for oil, and had been organized by the steel workers. And one thing that being young and dumb weren't aware of is with a rich history, actually, in bringing the CIO there to Hughes Tool Company in Houston. For in the 30s, they actually had two company unions, one black, one white. And in the early 40s, it's an attempt to actually bring the CIO to Hughes Tool Company. It lost initially, but that you had a sense of history and unionization back to that time period. In the early 60s, actually, there's a classic lawsuit filed by black workers at Hughes that ended segregated unions explicitly. And so some people who were actually filed suit were still at the company itself. And so this long history of activism there that we weren't fully aware of because we were what they call young and dumb. Now, I don't want to cast a brush on all young people, by the way, but my crew, I'll say, was young and dumb. I'll commit to that at least. One way I talk about that in terms of our kind of youthful energy, kind of the good, is that some people we worked with actually organized a walkout in the 73 around the issue of Juneteenth. As you listeners may know, that particularly in Texas, a very rich history of Black celebration of freedom. And so the idea was that why should we wait for the man to say we take a day off? We're going to walk out. And so we helped organize the entire department walked out for Juneteenth. One of the good things we did. Some of the stupid stuff, we didn't realize that the steel workers in Houston had left the labor council over race. That around the divide over pro or con on civil rights, the steelworkers were the good people, good guys in Texas. We didn't realize that. We just threw stones because they're all trade union bureaucrats. And so the good things and bad things. Yeah.
Live and learn, I guess.
Yeah, hopefully.
So for those who may not be interested or aware of labor news, why do you think unions and organized labor are important and should be covered?
Wow. That's a very broad question. Let me say two fundamental things to start with. I mean, one is the whole question of how you divide the pie up, basically. The thing of economic activity is making a pie, a big fat unit of the pie, apple pie, cherry pie, Boston cream pie, I don't care what it is, right? And the question, who gets the share, who gets the pie? That's a battle around power. We were talking about being wages, benefits, whatever you call it. That issue is a matter of power. And so the extent that workers come together to work collectively, we get a larger share of the pie. That's at one level. But also think beyond the idea of dollars and cents, it's a matter of respect on the job and be able to deal with the question of the arbitrary power of the supervisor or the boss, depending on the jargon we use the day, over the worker, him or herself. And oftentimes we get so wrapped up in the dollars and cents questions around unionization, we forget the question of dignity on the job. I talked to Bill Lucy on my last show on Black Work Talk, and Bill Lucy was a staffer for AFSCME in Memphis during the sanitation strike in '68. And he spoke of the fact how that strike really was a strike around recognition. It wasn't a strike around economics. It's the idea of saying, wait a second, the city of Memphis, you got to recognize us as a body to deal with. And you had to end the kind of the abusive powers of the boss. And to me, that's an important issue of the question of unions. How do you simply change the power dynamic on the shop floor? The whole question of actually work organization to be central. There are oftentimes, because we focus on the first issue, the dollars and cents, we can wrap up in policies and higher minimum wage and Medicare for all. Important policies, by the way, but we can't let the drive for policies to impact labor standards override the issue of actually changing the power in the shop floor itself.
Yeah. I grew up in this, what I like to term as the Reagan arena. Like I was born in '78, and the whole 40 years we've been in this Reagan arena, and we're moving
My
into a
condolences,
new.
by the way.
Say that again.
My condolences.
And I think we're moving into a new arena, and the question is it going to be even more brutal, or is it going to be a little more humane, I guess? But I do think there is a revolution that is going on, and during that 40 year of the Reagan arena, like people in my generation didn't really see labor, at least in many areas, unless you were directly in a family with someone in a labor union, or you're working in one of those unions as well. It has changed, and I think it's changing a lot. But I think a lot of the labor news, there used to be labor news columns in all the newspapers, and those went away. And so looking at your show, could you talk a bit about your show and how it highlights labor and what it's about and how you came to start it?
Let me step back a second and kind of deal with some things you said prior to the explicit question. We had the peak of union density, the share of workers in unions was in the 50s, and the number was around 35%. And if you think about the number in a very kind of strange way, that go to your backyard and you look to your left, to your right, and three neighbors are talking. One of those folk were in unions, so there's a workforce. So it meant that unions were deeply, deeply in the air we breathed. And clearly, because the distribution wasn't random distributed, in some neighborhoods, everybody's in the union. And what happened starting really in the mid-70s was a sharp decline in unionization. We blame it on Reagan, really it predates Reagan. We had really an age of inequality that began in the mid-70s. So that's kind of the starting point. That the idea that folk of your generation don't know the union is not like your fault, by the way. Simple unions were less and less on the scene, basically. I thought, so I worked at the Labor Center, UC Berkeley for 19 years, started in 2001, retired in 2020. And for most of that time, my focus was on Black workers and the issue of job quality. And we had kind of a frame that we said for the work, saying there was a two-dimensional job problem in the Black community, unemployment and low-wage work. And that frame was important because oftentimes when people speak of Black job problems, they highlight the issue of unemployment and the issue of low-wage work. And the reality that most Black folk work, they're working shitty jobs. And so we're trying to change how folk looked at the question of Black work. And in some ways, the show, Black Work Talk, is an extension of that. But I think that there's a lot of dimensions of Black worker issues, be it, say, data perspectives, be it from the issue of 30,000 feet and big theoretical perspectives, be the issue of day-to-day problems, be the issue of in unions. Folk don't know about it at all. We organized a Black union leadership school when I was working at the Labor Center. And one year we had a joint sort of labor community membership there. And one sister was actively involved in the issue of policy around former incarceration. She's former incarcerated. She loved the program because in her policy world and her kind of coalition world, all she met were union folk, were white folks. And she knew Black folks were in unions at all until she came to our class and met people and developed bonds and relationships. So I think that amongst a lot of parts of our society, the idea of Black unionists is not a real live question. So I think the idea that the show can project the question of Black workers and Black views and our working class views in different ways is the central focus of what we're trying to do.
Yeah, that's it. At the UC Berkeley Center, can you talk a little bit more about that? Because I see there's universities that have created and carved out these niche areas where they are promoting greater consciousness of union and organized labor and labor history. And there's also labor archivists that are all over the United States, and some of them are underfunded. And I am curious about your experience at UC Berkeley and trying to look at how we can kind of widen the labor education as well, and through that lens.
Yeah, I call it a blessed job. I have a variety of skills and interests. My basic interest is social change. I'm a trained economist. I'm Dr. Pitt's researcher. I taught in the community college for 15 years in Houston after I left the factory. So I enjoyed education as well. And the Labor Center gave me a chance to meld those interests together. And we were all rowing in the same direction for the cause. So it's like an ideal job. I couldn't design a real job that'd be better than that, to be honest. But it's important to recognize that our existence is because of labor and because of power, once again. That really, the origin of the Labor Center come out of the post-World War II era of industrial relations and trying to look at how we can get labor and capital to get along better. In the mid-60s, the labor movement in California thought that the Institute was getting a bit too academic, as they pushed for the creation up at UC Berkeley and at UCLA of the labor centers that be more of an outreach arm to bring kind of the skills of the university to the labor movement and the broader community. Folk would think they're doing good things for several decades, and at a certain point, the thought was maybe to sunset out of existence, the labor centers. And because of the power of labor and the surplus in the state budget in California, they had a major increase in the funding for labor centers. So I want to say that, first of all, that the source of good work comes from power. It doesn't come from smart people. It doesn't come from nice people. It comes from power itself. To the extent that we want to expand the reach of labor, be it labor education, labor organizing, whatever you want to call it, it's also the question, how can we build power sufficient to achieve what we want to achieve? I say oftentimes that the right in the 90s started to say that 2 + 2 is 5, what you can do about it? And we didn't have the power to say, I don't think so, 2 + 2 is 4. And we saw this today with the lies that Trump and his ilk said after the elections. It's the question of power. So because the power of the labor movement in California, we saw the labor centers existing. And normally when we look around across the country, those universities have strong labor centers in some form. You'll see that fairly strong with the labor movement as well.
So talking about the Labor Radio Podcast Network, how did you hear about it? And we're constantly looking to expand it. We're in 5 countries right now. And how did you come about it? And why do you think this network is important?
Well, to be honest, you found me. I was true. All of a sudden, I'm trying to start the podcast and see what's happening. And all of a sudden, I get a letter, hey, we're the Labor Radio Podcast Network. You want to join? Sounds cool. So literally, you found me. I didn't know you existed until you found me. It's a very good thing you're doing, though, by the way. Because I think that there's clear value in when having various forms of radio and being an old head, podcast and radio, by the way, okay? It's important to have that. And to the extent that you can network the activity, it will increase the scale and the quality of the work. So I'm excited to be a part of the network.
And if you hear of other ones that we can kind of poach and recruit as well, definitely share that, because we're looking to constantly expand and support each other. So in closing, looking into the future of organized labor, where do you see opportunity and hope?
Wow. I think you see kind of green shoots in a lot of different areas, You see both the consistent sort of fighting around teacher union organizing and healthcare as well that predates the current crises. Unfortunately, because of the activity of teachers and nurses, we're in a strong position now during the pandemic. So I think those are 2 sectors we see some clear possibilities and good things happening. I mean, you're seeing the bubbling around tech workers. And actually there's different dimensions, both kind of the tech workers, meaning who makes the codes, right? But it's also part of tech that actually fuels tech with the janitors and service workers. And we see bubbling organizing in those areas as well, both from both dimensions, both kind of from the service worker dimension and from kind of the tech worker dimension. That's clearly positive. We see some, I won't quite call them green shoots, but we see a lot of things happening on Amazon, which is important. Amazon and Walmart are the big monsters we got to conquer. It's going to be incredibly difficult, but it's going to happen. If you go back in history, folks said that you couldn't organize GM, you couldn't organize Ford. And we flayed those monsters. And so it will happen again. So that's very promising. I think the fact that people younger than you are coming up away from the crush of Reagan and the crush of the Red Scare means that ideas are more open and on socialism and opposing capitalism that didn't exist before. There are kind of constraints, and that kind of freeing the mind by itself is also a very positive setting for today. And so I think that those are clearly important things to understand. I think people are seeing the connection of race and capitalism, which is a positive thing. I think one thing that happened in the Red Scare was kind of the fissure between civil rights and labor, in some ways, for sure intellectually, and kind of in terms of regulations as well. It's coming together more and more, which is going to strengthen both movements in many ways. So those are all some positive things. It's going to be hard, by the way, because we're moving to new territory. And also it's hard because you have kind of the federal government fundamentally against what we're doing, different degrees that's against us. And with the federal government that way, it's going to make it harder to do good union organizing, not impossible. We need the federal government to kind of stand down in some ways. And when they stand down, it'll be impossible to have better and better, more richer organizational successes.
You better listen, my brother, 'cause if you do, you can hear there are voices still calling from across the years. And they're crying across the ocean, they're crying across the land, and they will until we all come to understand. None of us are free, none of us are free, none of us are free, and one of us is chained. None of us are free, 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 and one of us is chained. None of us are free. There are people in darkness, they just can't see the light. If we don't say it's wrong, then that says it's right. We got to feel for each other, let our brothers know we're here. Got to get the message, send it out all loud and clear. None of us are free, none of us are free, none of us are free, if one of us is chained. None of us are free. It's the single truth we all need to see. None of us are free, if one of us is chained. None of us are free. Well, I swear to you, salvation isn't very hard to find. None of us can find it on our own. We got to join together, spirit, heart, and mind, so all the souls are suffering know